I slept with my wife's younger sister. Ada? The question burned in my mind like a brand, searing and relentless. Am I the asshole? I could already hear the chorus of voices, righteous and judgmental, declaring their verdict. But life isn't so black and white, is it? At least that's what I've told myself to dull the pang of shame that's been gnawing at me ever since that night. Let me start from the beginning, from when the cracks in my seemingly perfect life began to form. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 8 years. 8 years of partnership, laughter, and routine. We met in our mid-20s, when life felt full of promise. Emily was everything I thought I wanted: ambitious, grounded, and fiercely loyal. Together, we built a life that, from the outside, seemed enviable. A comfortable home, 2 young daughters, a dog named Max. The quintessential suburban dream. But beneath the polished veneer, something was missing. Emily had always been a deeply practical person. Her love was steady but predictable. Over the years, our marriage had evolved into a series of obligations: parent-teacher conferences, grocery lists, weekend errands. Intimacy became another item on our to-do list, penciled in between soccer practices and work deadlines. I didn't blame her entirely. It was a shared failing. Somewhere along the way, we lost each other in the whirlwind of everyday life. Enter Sophie. Sophie was Emily's younger sister, the polar opposite of her in almost every way. Where Emily was structured and methodical, Sophie was impulsive and carefree. She had this magnetic energy about her, the kind that made people want to be around her. She had recently returned to town after a bad breakup and was crashing at our place for a few weeks. Those weeks turned into months. At first, I hardly noticed her presence. She was family, after all, and it wasn't unusual for Sophie to pop in and out of our lives. But as the weeks wore on, I found myself drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably stunning: dark curls, piercing green eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. It was her spirit. She made me feel something I hadn't felt in years: alive. It started innocently enough. Casual conversations while Emily was out running errands. A shared laugh over a bottle of wine after the kids were in bed. Little moments that at the time seemed harmless. But looking back, I see them for what they were: the first steps down a slippery slope. The night it happened, Emily was out of town for a work conference. Sophie and I had stayed up late watching a movie. The kids were asleep, the house was quiet, and the air between us felt charged in a way I couldn't ignore. She leaned against me during a particularly tense scene, her head resting on my shoulder. My heart raced, my mind screaming at me to get up, to walk away. But I didn't. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were kissing. It was frantic, desperate, and completely out of control. The weight of years of suppressed frustration and longing came crashing down all at once. By the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. The morning after, Sophie and I avoided each other. She left the house before Emily returned, and we haven't spoken about it since. But the guilt stayed, heavy and suffocating. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the thrill of feeling wanted again, the allure of something forbidden. Or maybe it was a desperate cry for help, a sign that my marriage was crumbling in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. Emily doesn't know. Part of me thinks she never will, but another part of me dreads the day the truth comes out. Would she forgive me? Should she? Sophie hasn't come back to our house since that night. Emily thinks it's because Sophie is embarrassed about overstaying, her welcome. But I know the real reason. Every time I hear Emily mention her sister, I feel like I'm suffocating. So here I am, living with a secret that threatens to destroy everything I've built. I know what I did was wrong. There's no justifying it. But part of me can't stop wondering if this was the wake-up call I needed, a painful reminder of what's truly at stake. Am I the asshole? Probably. But maybe the better question is, Where do I go from here? The days that followed were a torment. Every look Emily gave me felt like it carried an unspoken question, though I knew that was just my paranoia speaking. The guilt had planted roots deep within me, and every passing moment seemed to water it. I couldn't escape it. Each smile from her, every innocent hug from my kids, was a reminder of the boundary I'd crossed. Sophie had gone silent. No calls, no texts, no casual drop-ins. Her absence hung over the house like a storm cloud. Emily seemed puzzled but didn't push it. "She's always been unpredictable," she said one evening over dinner, her fork lazily moving food around. Her plate. "Probably just needs some space." Her trust in me made it worse. I couldn't sleep. The few hours I managed were riddled with dreams, some of that night, others of Emily finding out. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, her name on my lips like a desperate plea. But Sophie, she was the wild card. I couldn't predict what she'd do, what she might say. Was she carrying the same guilt I was? Or had she moved on, brushing it off as another of her reckless mistakes? I found myself checking my phone constantly, half dreading, half hoping for a message from her. Days turned into weeks, and the silence stretched unbearably thin. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed. I was in my office, staring blankly at a spreadsheet I'd been pretending to work on, when her name lit up the screen. My stomach twisted as I picked it up. "Sophie, we need to talk." I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of how to respond. Every possibility flashed through my mind: anger, regret, confession, denial. Finally, I settled on the safest response I could muster. "Me. Okay. When?" Her reply was instant. "Sophie. Tonight. I'll text you where." That night, I told Emily I had a late meeting. The lie rolled off my tongue so easily it made me sick. She kissed me goodbye, her lips soft and warm, and I nearly broke. I nearly turned around and told her everything, but I didn't. Sophie chose a quiet bar on the edge of town, far from the places Emily and I usually went. When I arrived, she was already there, nursing a glass of wine and staring out the window. She looked tired, her usually vibrant energy muted. "Hi," I said, sliding into the seat across from her. My voice felt too loud, too sharp in the quiet space. She glanced up, her green eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Hi," she finally said, her voice soft. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words. I ordered a drink, though I wasn't sure I'd be able to swallow it. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, breaking the tension. She sighed, running a hand through her dark curls. "That night, it shouldn't have happened." I nodded, the knot in my chest tightening. "I know. I've been trying to figure out what to do," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to hurt Emily. She's my sister. But I also can't pretend like nothing happened." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. "I've been going over it in my head 1,000 times, I admitted, my voice low. "I wish I could take it back." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, I saw the Sophie I'd known before. That night, the carefree, vibrant spirit that had drawn me in. "Me too," she said. We talked for hours, hashing through our regrets, our fears, our shared guilt. She promised she wouldn't tell Emily, at least not yet. "But you need to figure out what you're going to do," she said firmly. "This isn't sustainable. You can't live like this." She was right. When I got home that night, Emily was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch, a book in her lap, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "Fine," I lied, kissing her on the forehead. But as I stood there, looking at her, the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my children, I realized something had to give. The secret was a ticking time bomb, and I was the only one who could decide when it would go off. The days blurred together after that conversation with Sophie. Every moment I spent with Emily felt like it had a magnifying glass held over it. Her laughter seemed louder, her touch warmer, her trust sharper. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was dread. I'd built my life with her, brick by brick, and now it felt like I was walking on a crumbling foundation I'd sabotaged with my own hands. I tried to push forward, to act normal, but normal wasn't sustainable anymore. Sophie's words echoed in my head constantly. You can't live like this. She was right. The lie had a life of its own, growing, tangling its roots into every corner of my mind. But telling the truth? That felt like setting a match to the life I'd built. One evening, Emily suggested we host a family dinner. It's been a while, since everyone's been together, she said, her voice warm with excitement. My heart sank. Everyone? Of course. Sophie, too, she said, not noticing the slight edge to my voice. It wasn't long before the night arrived. Emily had gone all out. Her famous lasagna was in the oven, the table was set with her favorite china, and the house smelled of rosemary and garlic. The kids were buzzing with excitement, running around the house. And then Sophie arrived. She walked in with a bottle of wine and a carefully practiced smile. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the flicker of discomfort in her eyes when our gazes met. But Emily didn't notice. She hugged Sophie tightly, her face glowing with happiness. You've been so busy lately, Emily said, pulling back. I've missed you. Me too, Sophie said softly. Dinner was a blur. Every laugh, every clink of a glass, every glance Sophie and I exchanged felt like a minefield. Emily was radiant, her joy filling the room, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Halfway through, Emily raised her glass for a toast. To family, she said, smiling warmly. To love and loyalty. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Sophie's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. To family, we all echoed, though the words burned on my tongue. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the kids were asleep, Emily and I sat on the couch. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. Tonight was perfect, she said, her voice soft. I stared at the darkened TV screen, my chest tightening. Yeah, it was. She tilted her head up to look at me, her eyes searching mine. You've seemed distracted lately? Is everything okay? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. This was it, my chance to tell her the truth, to lay it all bare. But as I looked into her eyes, so full of love and trust, I froze. I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile. Just work stress. She nodded, seeming to accept it, and nestled back into my shoulder. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the secret pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I thought about Emily, about Sophie, about the life we'd built and the choices I'd made to jeopardize it. I knew I couldn't keep this up. Sophie was right. It wasn't sustainable. The lie would come out eventually, one way or another. And when it did, the fallout would be catastrophic. The next morning, I made a decision. I would tell Emily, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because she deserved the truth. Because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Because, for better or worse, the truth was the only way forward. As I sat across from her at the breakfast table watching her sip her coffee, I took a deep breath. Emily, I began, my voice trembling. There's something I need to tell you. Emily lowered her coffee cup, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. Her eyes locked onto mine, curious but calm. She wasn't expecting anything seismic. Not yet. That would change in moments. What's wrong? She asked, her brows furrowing slightly. My mouth felt dry, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. The words swirled in my head, fighting to escape, but each attempt at speaking felt like leaping off a cliff. Say it. Just say it. I took another breath, forcing myself to hold her gaze. I've made a terrible mistake, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. And it's something I should have told you a long time ago. Her face shifted, the furrow deepening into a mask of concern. What do you mean? My voice cracked, and I clenched my fists under the table to keep from trembling. Emily, I betrayed you. The words hit the air like a grenade, and her expression froze, her body stiffening as if bracing for an impact. She didn't say anything, didn't blink, just stared at me, waiting. I slept with Sophie, I said, my voice breaking completely this time. The moment the words left my mouth, I wished I could pull them back, undo everything. But they were out there now, irreversible, a wrecking ball crashing into the life we'd built. Emily's face went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, it was as if she couldn't process the words, couldn't connect them to the reality of her life. Then the shock gave way to something far more devastating. You're joking, she said, her voice trembling, though it wasn't a question. Her hands clenched the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. I wish I were, I said, my voice hollow. It happened once. A stupid, reckless mistake. Stop, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and her eyes brimmed with tears, though she refused to let them fall. How could you? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. How could you do this to me? To us? I stood too, desperate to explain, to say something that could make her understand, even though I knew there was nothing. It didn't mean anything. Oh, don't you dare, she snapped, her voice rising. Don't you dare try to downplay it like that. You slept with my sister, for God's sake. My sister, how could you even— She trailed off, shaking her head as if trying to dispel the thoughts forming in her mind. Her hands flew to her head, clutching her hair as she paced the kitchen. I know I messed up, I said, my voice cracking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but— You're damn right you don't, she shot back, her eyes blazing now. Do you have any idea what you've done? What this will do to me? To our family? Her words hit me like punches, each one deserved. I couldn't argue, couldn't defend myself. She was right, about everything. Did she know? Emily demanded suddenly, her voice icy. Did Sophie know what she was doing when she— Her voice broke, and she stopped, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Sophie had known, of course. She'd been just as complicit, just as guilty. But saying that felt like throwing her under the bus, and it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal. Yes, I admitted quietly. She knew. Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Of course she did. God, I've been so blind. Her words stung, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. She had trusted me, trusted Sophie, and we had both shattered that trust in the worst possible way. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice barely audible. I never wanted to hurt you. She turned to me then, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and devastation. You didn't just hurt me, she said, her voice low and trembling. You destroyed me. You destroyed us. And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, drowning in the wreckage of what I had done. The silence that followed her exit was deafening, oppressive in a way I hadn't anticipated. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the door she had walked through, every fiber of my being urging me to follow her, to try again, to explain, to beg her to give me even the faintest chance at redemption. But what could I say? What could possibly be enough? I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping its edge so tightly I thought the wood might splinter beneath my fingers. The weight of what I'd done bore down on me like a crushing tide, drowning me in guilt, regret, and the sharp sting of my own selfishness. Her words echoed in my mind. You destroyed me. You destroyed us. The enormity of it all hit me then, the full gravity of the betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a rupture, a gaping wound that couldn't simply be stitched up and forgotten. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. My mind replayed that night with Sophie in excruciating detail. Not the act itself, but everything surrounding it. The excuses I'd told myself, the alcohol-fueled haze that had dulled my better judgment, the fleeting thrill of stepping into forbidden territory. And now, sitting here alone in the wreckage of my decisions, I saw it for what it truly was. A moment of weakness that had cost me everything. Hours passed. Or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell. Time had lost all meaning in the chaos of my thoughts. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards above me. Emily must have gone to the bedroom, or maybe she was pacing the upstairs hall trying to decide what to do next. Eventually, I couldn't bear the stillness any longer. I got up, my legs heavy, and made my way upstairs. Every step felt like a march to my own execution. The bedroom door was closed. I hesitated outside, my hand hovering over the knob. I could hear her faintly on the other side, muffled sobs breaking through the silence. The sound cut through me like a blade, each one, a reminder of the pain I'd inflicted. I knocked softly. Emily? My voice was tentative, barely audible. There was no answer, just the sound of her crying. I know you don't want to see me right now, I said, leaning against the doorframe. And I don't blame you. I need you to know how sorry I am. I know that doesn't fix anything, but... The door flew open and Emily stood there, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She looked at me with a mixture of heartbreak and fury that made me want to shrink into nothingness. Do you think an apology will fix this? She said, her voice raw. Do you think saying you're sorry erases what you did? No, I said quickly. I don't, but I don't know what else to do. Then let me help you, she said coldly. You can pack your things and leave. That's what you can do. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't argue. She had every right to ask me to leave, every right to want me out of her life. Emily, please, I said, my voice cracking. Don't make any decisions right now. Let's just talk. Talk? She interrupted, her voice rising. Talk about what? How you betrayed me? How you slept with my sister? How you ruined everything we had? What's left to talk about, huh? I had no answer. She shook her head, stepping back into the room. I can't even look at you right now, she said, her voice quieter now, trembling. Just go, please. I opened my mouth to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped me. There was no room for argument, no room for negotiation. She needed space, and I owed her that much at least. Without another word, I turned and walked back. Down the hall, my heart heavy with the weight of finality. The night was long and merciless. I sat in the living room, staring at the darkened walls, my mind racing with thoughts of what I could have done differently, what I could possibly do now to salvage even a shred of what we had. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't something I could fix. This wasn't a wound that could be healed with apologies or promises. I had destroyed the trust between us, shattered it into pieces so small that no amount of effort could ever put it back together. And now, all I could do was wait. Wait. To see if there was even a sliver of hope left in the ruins of our marriage. The next morning, the light streaming through the blinds seemed to mock me, casting its indifferent glow on a life I had irreparably broken. I hadn't slept. How could I? My mind had churned through every agonizing detail of the betrayal, playing it on an endless loop, each repetition more unbearable than the last. Emily hadn't come downstairs. I wasn't sure if that was a good sign or just another indication of how deeply I had wounded her. I stared at the untouched coffee cup on the table in front of me, the steam long since dissipated, just as any semblance of normalcy in our lives had. At some point, I heard footsteps on the stairs. My heart lurched, but I didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to face her yet, even though I knew I had no choice. The weight of the silence that followed her descent into the kitchen was suffocating. She didn't look at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements mechanical, like she was simply going through the motions. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from a night of crying. It took everything in me not to speak, to let her have the space she clearly needed. Finally, she broke the silence. "I called Sophie this morning," she said, her voice low but steady. My stomach dropped. What did she say?" I asked, my voice hesitant. Emily set her mug down on the counter and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "She admitted everything," she said. "She didn't even try to deny it. She said it was a mistake, that it just happened." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she looked away, as if the very memory of Sophie's explanation was too much to bear. I felt the familiar wave of guilt crash over me, suffocating in its intensity. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I knew the words were meaningless at this point. Emily's gaze snapped back to me, sharp and full of anger. "You keep saying that," she said, her voice trembling. "But what are you sorry for, exactly? For doing it or for getting caught?" Her words cut deep, but I knew she deserved an honest answer. "For everything," I said, "for hurting you, for betraying you, for being so stupid and selfish." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "Stupid and selfish," she repeated. "That's putting it lightly." We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension in the room almost unbearable. I wanted to say more, to beg her to believe that I regretted every single moment of what I'd done. But I knew that words wouldn't be enough. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know if I even want to try." The weight of her words settled heavily in the room, suffocating and final. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I forced it down. This wasn't about me. This was about her, about the pain I had caused her and the irreparable damage I had done to our marriage. "I understand," I said quietly, "and I'll do whatever you need me to do, whether it's giving you space or leaving." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the mug in her hands. Finally, she sighed, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I don't know what I need right now," she said, "but I know I can't even think about it with you here." Her words were like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, forcing myself to accept them. "I'll go," I said. "I'll pack some things and leave. Take all the time you need." Emily didn't respond, and I took that as my cue to leave. As I turned to head upstairs, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had lost, I heard her voice behind me, soft and almost hesitant. "For what it's worth," she said, "I did love you. I just don't know if I can anymore." I froze, her words cutting through me like a knife. I wanted to turn back, to say something, anything, that could make her believe in us again. But I knew that was impossible. So I simply nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and continued up the stairs. Packing was harder than I had anticipated. Every item I placed into the suitcase felt like another reminder of what I had lost, of the life I had thrown away with one reckless, selfish decision. When I came back downstairs, Emily was gone, probably upstairs avoiding me. I didn't blame her. I left the house quietly, the sound of the door closing behind me feeling like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. And as I drove away, my suitcase in the back seat, and my heart shattered beyond repair, I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way back from this, or if I had truly destroyed the one thing that mattered most. Over the next few weeks, the emptiness in my new temporary apartment became my constant companion. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and the air thick with regret. It was a far cry from the warmth and chaos of the home Emily and I had, built together, a home I had taken for granted. I didn't hear from Emily, not a single text, call, or email. At first, I tried to respect her silence, convincing myself that giving her space was the right thing to do. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of the unknown began to crush me. I busied myself with work, though I could barely focus. My colleagues noticed my distracted state, but no one said anything outright. The shame of what I'd done loomed over me, even in conversations that had nothing to do with my personal life. It was as though I carried a scarlet letter invisible to everyone but myself. Then came the letter. It arrived one morning in a plain white envelope, slipped under the door of my apartment. My heart pounded as I recognized Emily's handwriting on the front. I hesitated, staring at it as though it were a live grenade. Was this it? Was this her way of telling me she was filing for divorce? Or perhaps it was just closure, an acknowledgement, that we were truly over. I tore it open, my hands trembling. Daniel, I've spent the last few weeks trying to untangle the mess of emotions I've been drowning in. Anger, betrayal, sadness. And underneath it all, this persistent, aching love that refuses to leave, no matter how much I wish it would. You hurt me in a way I never thought possible. You broke something in me, in us, that I don't know if we can ever repair. But I've also realized that I can't ignore my own part in this. I let the distance between us grow. I let our communication falter. I stopped noticing the cracks in our foundation because it was easier than confronting them. This doesn't excuse what you did. Nothing can. But it does make me wonder if this marriage is worth fighting for. I've decided I'm willing to try. Not for you and not for the person I thought you were, but for the life we built together. For the possibility that buried beneath all this pain, there's something left to salvage. If you're willing to do the hard work, therapy, honesty, accountability, then maybe we can start to rebuild. But know this, I am not offering forgiveness yet. That has to be earned and it will take time. If you feel the same, meet me at the coffee shop where we had our first date. Saturday, 3 p.m. If you don't show, I'll understand. It will mean you've made your choice, and I'll make mine. Emily. I reread the letter several times, my emotions swinging wildly between hope and fear. This was a chance I didn't deserve, but one I desperately wanted to take. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. When the day finally arrived, I found myself pacing outside the coffee shop nearly an hour early. I kept second-guessing myself, wondering if I even had the right to show up. But then I thought about Emily, about the life we had shared and the life we might still have a chance to rebuild. At exactly 3 p.m., she walked in. She looked both the same and different, her posture a little more guarded, her expression unreadable. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on me. For a moment, she simply stood there, and I held my breath, unsure if she would turn around and walk away. But then she crossed the room and sat down across from me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy with everything we needed to say, but didn't know how to. Finally, Emily broke it. "So," she said, her voice steady but cautious, "are you ready to prove to me that this wasn't the end of us?" Her question hung in the air, and I knew that my answer, my actions from this moment forward, would determine the rest of our lives. "Yes," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "I'm ready." And so our journey toward healing began, fraught with challenges, painful truths, and moments of doubt, but also glimmers of hope. Whether we could truly rebuild what had been broken was uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of possibility. And for now, that was enough. The following weeks were a fragile balancing act, with every conversation, every action, feeling like a tightrope walk. Emily and I began seeing a therapist together, a neutral ground where we could untangle the mess of emotions, resentments, and fears. Our first session was uncomfortable, to say the least. Sitting side by side in the small, dimly lit room, I could feel Emily's guardedness radiating off her. The therapist, a calm and patient woman named Dr. Keller, started by asking us to articulate why we were there. "I want to see if this is salvageable," Emily said plainly, her voice void of warmth but steady with resolve. "I'm not here to excuse what happened. I'm here to understand if we can move past it or if I'm wasting my time." Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't blame her for her honesty. When it was my turn, I hesitated. My throat felt tight, as though every word I tried to push out would get caught. Finally, I managed. "I'm here because I love you, Emily. Because I don't want what I did to define the rest of our lives. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to earn it. I want to fix this, if you'll let me." Dr. Keller nodded, her expression neutral but attentive. "Good. The first step is recognizing that healing is a choice you both have to make every day. It won't be easy, and there will be times when it feels impossible. But if you're both committed, there's hope." The hard conversations. Of the hardest parts of therapy was facing the raw truth of Emily's pain. She didn't hold back, and I didn't expect her to. "You didn't just betray me," she said during one session, her voice trembling with emotion. "You made me question everything about myself. Was I not enough? Was our life together so meaningless that you could just throw it away for a moment of, what? Excitement? Validation?" Her words cut deep, and I fought the urge to defend myself or explain away my actions. Dr. Keller had warned me against this, telling me that sometimes the only thing I could do was listen and acknowledge the pain I'd caused. "I was selfish," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I let my own insecurities and weaknesses take over. It wasn't about you, Emily. It was never about you not being enough. It was about me feeling like I wasn't enough and looking for something to fill that void in all the wrong places." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I don't know if I'll ever believe that completely," she said, "but I needed to hear you say it." The small steps forward. Outside of therapy, we began rebuilding our relationship, piece by piece. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping promises. It was about the small, consistent actions that showed I was committed to change. I started being more present, really present, in our conversations. I asked about her day, her thoughts, her feelings, and I listened without distraction or defensiveness. I took over more responsibilities around the house, not as a way to earn points, but because I wanted to show her that I was willing to put in the effort. We even started going on dates again, though they were awkward at first. The first time we sat across from each other at a nice restaurant, the silence was deafening. But over time, the walls began to come down, and we rediscovered small pockets of laughter and connection. Facing the family. One of the biggest hurdles came when Emily decided it was time to tell her family about what had happened. Up until that point, we'd kept the details of my infidelity private, but she felt that in order to truly heal, she needed to be honest with the people closest to her. I dreaded the day we sat down with her parents, knowing that their disappointment would be almost as painful as Emily's had been. Her father, a stoic and reserved man, said little during the conversation, his expression unreadable. Her mother, on the other hand, was visibly upset. "How could you do this to her?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "After everything she's given you, everything you've built together?" "I don't have an excuse," I said, my voice steady but filled with remorse. All I can say is that I regret it more than anything I've ever done. And I'm doing everything I can to make it right. Emily's father finally spoke, his tone measured but firm. We'll support Emily in whatever she decides. But understand this, Daniel. You're on thin ice. One more misstep, and you're done. The long road ahead. As the months passed, the highs and lows of our journey began to even out. There were still moments of tension and doubt, but there were also glimmers of hope, shared smiles, quiet moments of understanding, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Emily wasn't ready to say she forgave me, and I didn't push her. I knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on her terms and her timeline. For now, we were learning to navigate this new version of our relationship. Over the next few months, Emily and I continued to build on the fragile trust we had rekindled. Each small step forward felt monumental, like discovering a hidden treasure amidst the rubble of what we had once destroyed. But there were still moments of vulnerability when the wounds would reopen, reminding us of how fragile our progress truly was. One evening, as we were sorting through old photo albums, Emily paused on a picture of us from our honeymoon, a younger version of ourselves, beaming with the kind of unshakable confidence in love that only the newly married seem to possess. "Do you think we can ever get back to this?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing over the glossy image. I took a deep breath. "No," I admitted, meeting her gaze. "But maybe we can get to something even better, something real, something we've fought for." She stared at the photo for a long moment before closing the album. "I hope you're right," she said, and while her voice carried a tinge of doubt, there was also a flicker of hope. The power of ritual, one of the strategies Dr. Keller suggested, was creating rituals to help reconnect emotionally, small, deliberate acts that could serve as a reminder of our commitment to each other. So, every Sunday morning, we made it a point to sit on the porch together with coffee in hand. No distractions, no phones, just us. It was a simple gesture, but it became sacred, a space where we could speak openly or simply enjoy the silence, together. One morning, Emily turned to me as the sunlight filtered through the trees. "You know," she began, "these mornings have become my favorite part of the week. It's the only time I feel completely at peace." I smiled. "Me too." In those moments, I realized that love isn't always grand declarations or sweeping gestures. Sometimes it's as simple as being present, showing up, and creating a space where healing can happen. Unexpected allies. What surprised me most during this journey was the role that Emily's sister Claire played in our reconciliation. Initially, I had avoided her out of shame, but she had been one of Emily's greatest sources of support, and eventually, she began to extend that same understanding to me. One evening, Claire invited us both to dinner at her house. Over glasses of wine, she said something that stayed with me. "Emily loves you, Daniel. She wouldn't still be here if she didn't. But love isn't enough on its own. It needs action. And I've seen you putting in that action day by day. Don't lose sight of that." Her words struck a chord. It was a reminder that the effort wasn't just about proving myself to Emily. It was about building something new that could withstand the weight of our shared past. Facing the shadows. Despite our progress, there was one lingering issue we hadn't addressed: running into Sarah, the woman with whom I had betrayed Emily. It was inevitable, given the interconnected nature of our social circles, and the anxiety of that moment loomed over us like a dark cloud. When it finally happened, we were at a friend's birthday party. I saw Sarah across the room before Emily did, and my stomach dropped. "She's here," I whispered to Emily, my voice barely audible. Emily's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Sarah. For a moment, I saw the pain flash across her face, but then she squared her shoulders and took my hand. "Let's go talk to her," she said, surprising me. We approached Sarah, who looked equally uncomfortable. Emily was the first to speak. "Sarah," she said, her tone calm but firm, "I think it's best if we keep our distance tonight. I'm here to enjoy the evening with my husband, and I hope you'll respect that." Sarah nodded quickly, her gaze dropping. "Of course. I'm sorry," she murmured before walking away. I turned to Emily, overwhelmed by her composure. "That couldn't have been easy," I said. "It wasn't," she admitted, "but I'm not going to let her, or what happened, define us anymore." In that moment, I saw just how strong Emily had become, and I felt an even deeper resolve to be the partner she deserved. The turning point. As the third anniversary of the affair approached, Emily and I decided to take a trip to the cabin where we had spent our first wedding anniversary. It was a symbolic gesture, a chance to reflect on how far we had come and to recommit to the life we were rebuilding. On the last night of the trip, as we sat by the fire, Emily handed me a small box. "What's this?" I asked, puzzled. "Open it," she said with a faint smile. Inside was a simple silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Every day, I choose us." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at her. "Emily, She placed a finger on my lips, silencing me. "You've spent years proving yourself, Daniel, and I've spent years learning to trust again. We'll never forget what happened, but I think we're finally at a place where we can move forward. Together." The months that followed our trip to the cabin were quieter, more peaceful, though not without their challenges. We continued to rebuild, brick by brick, the foundation of our relationship, trying to craft something stronger than before. Our conversations became deeper, not just about the things that hurt, but about the things that made us whole, the little joys that often went unnoticed. We started to rediscover the small things that made us fall in love in the first place, the way Emily laughed at my terrible jokes, or the way I would catch her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. It was these subtle moments that began to stitch the rips in the fabric of our lives. We also started therapy together, even though neither of us had been thrilled about the idea at first. But over time, it became a place where we could explore our emotions more openly. Dr. Keller had said it before. Healing wasn't linear, and though I hated to admit it, I started to see how true that was. There were days when everything felt right, and others when the shadows of the past crept back in. But with each session, we learned to face them head-on. One evening, after a long week of work, Emily and I sat on the couch together, the evening sunlight pouring in through the windows. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt still and right, as if the world outside had momentarily faded into the background. I looked over at Emily, who had her head resting against the armrest, eyes closed. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood outside were the only things that filled the silence between us. "You know," I said, my voice quiet, unsure of how the words would land, "I don't think I ever really understood what love meant until I almost lost it." Emily opened her eyes slowly and met my gaze. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but instead she took a deep breath and nodded. "I think I've been figuring that out too." The vulnerability in her words caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming rush of gratitude for her willingness to confront the wreckage we had created together. I reached out and gently took her hand. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for what I did," I said, squeezing her hand. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." She gave me a soft smile, one that held more understanding than I had expected. "I don't need you to make up for it," she replied. "I just need you to be here, to keep showing up, to keep choosing us." And in that moment, I realized how much that simple act of showing up, of being present, was what really mattered. It wasn't grand gestures or promises of a perfect future. It was about consistency, about the quiet moments when the world seemed to pause, and we simply existed together. As the months continued to pass, we began to plan for the future again, something I had thought was lost to us forever. We started talking about things like buying a house, maybe having children one day. It was tentative, a slow progression, but it was a progression nonetheless. One of the most unexpected changes came when I realized that Emily had started to trust me again. I hadn't asked for that trust. I hadn't expected it. But slowly, like a flower unfurling, it began to take root once more. There were no dramatic moments, no forced declarations. It was just there, in the way she would look at me across a crowded room, or the way she would share her thoughts and feelings more openly. And in return, I learned how to truly listen, not just to her words, but to the unspoken ones as well. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find Emily in the kitchen, humming quietly to herself as she chopped vegetables. There was a softness in the air, an ease that had been missing for so long. She looked up when she heard me, her smile lighting up the room in a way that made my heart flutter, as it had when we first met. "Hey," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "I thought I'd surprise you with dinner." "You know you don't have to do that," I teased gently, stepping closer to her. "I would have been happy with just takeout." She laughed, the sound like music to my ears. "I know, but I thought I'd try to do something nice. I know we've been working hard on, well, everything. But I want to show you that I'm still here, still with you." Her words, so simple and yet so profound, filled me with more love and appreciation than I had words for. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I don't deserve this," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. She pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eye. "You do," she said firmly. "We both do." We were far from perfect. We knew that. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the same path again. There was a quiet comfort in the way we had begun to find our rhythm again. Every shared look, every conversation that stretched late into the night, began to stitch together the pieces of what had been shattered. But in the silence of the ordinary, there were still questions lingering between us, moments of doubt that crept into my mind when I least expected them. As we continued to rebuild, I realized how much the smallest acts of kindness, things I once took for granted, had become our foundation. A cup of coffee in the morning, her hand resting in mine as we watched the evening sky change colors, the quiet laughter over a shared joke. These were the moments that became our lifeline. One night, as we lay in bed, the cool breeze from the open window brushing against our skin, Emily turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "About us, about everything we've been through." I shifted slightly, my heart picking up pace. "What about it?" She hesitated, as though gathering her thoughts. "I think we've both changed. We've both been hurt. And I know we've talked about moving forward, but sometimes I wonder if we've really dealt with everything." I understood what she was saying. The scars, while fading, hadn't disappeared completely. The pain from the betrayal was still there, lurking beneath the surface, like a shadow we couldn't outrun. It was part of us now, woven into the fabric of our relationship. "I don't want to pretend it's gone," I said quietly. "I know it's still there for me, too." She nodded, biting her lip. "It's like we're rebuilding, but we're still standing on broken ground. It's hard to know if we can ever get back to where we were." I took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "Maybe we don't need to go back. Maybe we just need to keep moving forward one step at a time. It won't be easy, but we can make it work, if we're both willing to fight for it." Her eyes softened, and she seemed to search my face, as if weighing the sincerity of my words. After a long moment, she nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. "I'm willing to fight," she whispered, "if you are." And in that moment, I realized how much I had changed, too. The man I was before the betrayal was gone, replaced by someone who had seen the depths of pain and loss, and somehow still had the courage to try again. Maybe that was all we could do, try. Even when it felt like we were stumbling through the rubble of our own mistakes, trying to rebuild something that could withstand the weight of what had happened. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to feel a bit more like it used to, though with more care, more intention. We had set aside the heavy topics for a while, allowing ourselves to just be in the moment. We celebrated small victories like the first weekend we spent together without tension in the air, or the first time we laughed freely without an undercurrent of guilt. But the memories, the doubts, they still had a way of sneaking in when I least expected them. I caught myself sometimes, watching Emily as she worked in the garden or read a book, and wondering whether I could ever fully let go of the past. The thought of her betrayal still gnawed at me from time to time, though it had become less sharp, less immediate. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily turned to me again. This time her voice was steadier, more resolved. "I think we need to talk about the past," she said, her gaze fixed on the distance. "Not to rehash it, but because I think I've been avoiding it for too long." I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the conversation that was long overdue. "What do you want to say?" Her fingers toyed with the hem of her sleeve, as if she were gathering the strength to speak her truth. "I think I need you to understand that what happened, it wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was about my own insecurities, my own fears." I listened closely, watching her carefully, not interrupting as she continued. "I know I hurt you, and I know that nothing can undo that. But I want you to know that I never meant to break us. I never meant for it to go that far." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know what I was thinking, but I regret it. Every single day. And if there's any way for me to prove to you that I've learned from it, that I've changed, I want to try." Her words landed like a quiet promise, and for the first time, I believed them. I didn't know if I could forget what had happened, but in that moment, I knew that I wasn't as angry as I had been. The betrayal, while still present in my heart, no longer had the power to define us. "I believe you," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "I believe you, because I know I've changed too. And I think that's what matters." As the days stretched on, we found ourselves in a new rhythm, a rhythm that wasn't perfect, but was, in its own way, full of honesty and quiet resilience. We moved cautiously, as though walking on fragile ground, knowing that every step forward was a victory in its own right. The space between us, once thick with unspoken words and unresolved tensions, had begun to soften. But there were moments, fleeting and sharp, when the weight of the past would return. A touch too lingering, a glance too quick, and my mind would race. Is she still hiding something? Does she feel guilty every time she looks at me? The questions were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, like shadows that refused to fade no matter how brightly the sun shone. One night, as I lay awake beside her, the moonlight casting soft shadows across her face, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey we were on. The betrayal, once an insurmountable mountain, had slowly begun to feel like a landscape, less daunting when I could see it in the full light of the day, even though it still loomed in the distance. Could we ever truly heal? I wondered. Could I ever trust her fully again? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But one thing was certain. I was still here. She was still here. And maybe that was enough. Emily had begun to open up in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our late-night conversations, once tense and fraught with fear of what we might uncover, had evolved into quieter, deeper exchanges. We shared stories from our pasts, small, tender memories of childhoods we had never really explored together. We laughed about silly things, the way we both secretly loved the same trashy reality TV shows, or how she couldn't bake to save her life. We had grown more comfortable with the idea of rediscovering each other, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had been broken and were trying to rebuild something more real than what had come before. But still, there were the silences. The moments when she would look at me with those wide, searching eyes, as if gauging whether I still carried the weight of her mistakes on my shoulders. I could see the self-doubt flickering there, even though she never said it aloud. She was, in many ways, still testing the waters, unsure of what my forgiveness truly meant. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she finally broke the silence. "I know it's not easy," she began, her voice barely a whisper, the weight of her words settling between us. "I know that every day I'm asking for something more than I deserve, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for what I did, but I want to keep trying. For us. For you." I turned to her, my gaze steady. "I don't need you to make up for it. I just need you to be honest with me. And I need to be honest with you. We both have a lot to work through, but we don't have to do it alone." Her eyes softened at my words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of peace in the air. It was subtle, but it was there, a mutual understanding that we were both trying to be better, trying to rebuild what had been shattered, trying to love each other despite the scars. The truth was, I wasn't sure what the future held. I couldn't predict whether we would ever return to the place where trust and love flowed effortlessly, or if we would always carry the weight of what had happened. But there was one thing I knew with certainty. We were fighting for each other, for our family, and for the possibility of a life that, while imperfect, could still be rich in meaning. It wasn't an easy journey. It wasn't a smooth path. There were days when the old wounds would reopen, when the doubt would settle in my chest like a stone. But there were also days, many days, when I saw a glimmer of the person I had fallen in love with. And in those moments, I allowed myself to hope that we could come through this stronger than before. And so, we moved forward, with cautious optimism, with vulnerability, and with the quiet understanding that, even in the face of betrayal, there was still room for redemption, for healing, for love. Maybe, just maybe, we would be okay. The months that followed were not a straightforward journey. Each day carried its own challenges, and the weight of the past wasn't something we could simply brush away with time. It was like a scar that, even after it healed, still left an indelible mark. But there were moments, small moments, that allowed me to believe, however faintly, that we could start anew. I still found myself waking up in the middle of the night, my mind racing, filled with the echoes of questions and doubts. Had she truly changed? Would she betray me again, if the opportunity presented itself? Each thought was like a needle, pricking at my heart. But when I turned to her in the darkness, when I saw her face softened by sleep, a part of me still wanted to believe in the good that we once had. There were days when that belief was enough to quiet the storm in my mind, to calm the tumult of my emotions. One evening, she came to me with an earnest expression on her face. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice laced with vulnerability. "And I can never undo what I did." but I want you to know that I am working on being the person you deserve. I'm doing everything I can to earn back your trust, not because I want to erase what happened, but because I want us to have something real again." Her words, raw and unguarded, struck a chord deep within me. It wasn't the apology I had once dreamed of, nor was it the grand gesture I thought would make everything okay, but it was something more important. It was a commitment to change, to growth, to rebuilding what had been broken. And it was something I hadn't heard from her before, something that made me believe, for the first time in a long while, that she wasn't just saying the right words, she was living them. That night, we held each other tightly, letting the silence speak for us. There were no grand declarations, no promises of perfection, but in the quiet of our embrace, there was a fragile hope, a hope that despite everything, we could find our way back to each other. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fast. But it felt like a new beginning, one that was built not on the illusion of perfection, but on the reality of two people trying, despite their flaws and mistakes, to love each other again. We sought therapy, together and individually. We learned to communicate in ways we never had before, to be more open and vulnerable with each other, to face the discomfort and pain rather than hide from it. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start, and we began to see the cracks slowly heal over time. Each small step forward felt like progress, and those moments of tenderness and connection, when we could laugh again or share an honest moment, reminded me why we had made it this far in the first place. But even as we began to rebuild, I knew that the journey would never truly be without its struggles. Trust, once broken, was a fragile thing. And while we had made strides, there were still moments of uncertainty, moments when the past would creep into my mind like a shadow, threatening to steal the peace we had fought so hard to create. Still, in those moments, I reminded myself of one truth. Healing isn't linear. It's messy, it's complicated, but it's also beautiful in its own way. And though the road ahead might still be uncertain, one thing was clear. We were moving forward, together. The love that once seemed so easy and effortless had been tested, scarred, and reshaped. And while it would never be the same as it was before, perhaps that wasn't the point. Perhaps the love we had now, more mature, more aware, and more real, was the love we needed all along. As we continued on this winding path, I could feel both the tension and the tenderness that permeated our every interaction. The journey was far from a smooth one. There were days when I doubted, when I wondered if the wounds would ever fully heal. But then, in those rare, unexpected moments, like when we shared a quiet morning cup of coffee or when we exchanged a knowing look after a difficult conversation, I could see the flicker of the love we had once shared. And I held on to that flicker as if it were a lifeline. There were, of course, setbacks. Small things would trigger memories of the betrayal. A glance from her phone, a late-night message, or an unusual silence would send me spiraling into doubt. But I'd remind myself, healing is a process, not a destination. It's messy and uncertain, like trying to mend a broken vase with cracks. That will always be visible, but if you look closely, you see how the cracks tell a story. They show where things have broken and where they've been repaired. In the quiet moments of reflection, I realized something important. The affair had never just been a betrayal of trust. It had been a mirror to the cracks in our own relationship. We had neglected each other, we had become complacent, and somewhere along the way, we had both stopped tending to the love that had brought us together. The affair didn't cause our problems, it revealed them. And while I still couldn't understand why she had chosen that path, I had to acknowledge that I, too, had a role in where we ended up. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation, We sat on the couch, the weight of everything between us heavy in the room. I turned to her, my voice steady but vulnerable. I need to know if you're really here, not just because you want forgiveness, but because you want us. Because you're willing to fight for this, for us, just as much as I am. Her eyes softened. And for a moment, I saw the woman I had married. The one who had stood beside me through so much. The one I had once believed could be my everything. She reached out, taking my hand in hers. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've made mistakes. I've hurt you in ways I'll never be able to undo. But I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove that I can be the person you deserve. To prove that we can find our way back." We didn't have all the answers. There were no promises of perfection, no illusions of an easy road ahead. But in that moment, something shifted. We were no longer just two people trying to avoid the pain. We were two people willing to confront it, to face the hurt together and rebuild from the ashes. It wasn't easy. There were days when we stumbled, when we fell back into old patterns of mistrust and fear. But with each stumble, we picked ourselves up, dusted ourselves off, and tried again. Slowly, the darkness that had hung over us began to lift, replaced by tentative hope, by moments of understanding, by flashes of the connection we had once shared. We spent more time together, carving out space for each other amidst the chaos of our lives. We laughed more, argued less, and learned to listen in ways we hadn't before. We didn't just rebuild our relationship, we rebuilt ourselves too. We learned to communicate better, to be more open with each other, and most importantly, to never take one another for granted again. And while I couldn't forget the betrayal, I began to realize that perhaps forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it, acknowledging it, and choosing to move forward despite it. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined us. What mattered now was the love we were working to rebuild, piece by piece, day by day. As time passed, the healing process continued, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always moving forward. And in the quiet moments, when we simply sat together, our hands intertwined, I knew that we had something real again. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.